Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in the life of the empath, a soul finely tuned to the vibrations of others, when the call inward becomes louder than the cries around them. For too long, the empath wanders the labyrinth of other people's pain, believing their worth lies in healing what is not theirs to fix. But eventually, they arrive at a threshold. A sacred, terrifying moment of individuation, where the soul whispers, now, choose yourself. When the empath chooses themselves, something profound and unsettling begins to unfold. It is not merely a decision but an existential rupture. An unraveling of a deeply ingrained identity that has long been shaped by the emotional needs of others. The empath has been conditioned, often since childhood, to attune so finely to the emotional landscapes of those around them that they lose sight of their own inner terrain. They have been praised for their gentleness, admired for their compassion. But beneath the surface lies a silent erosion. Their boundaries have been blurred. Their voice, softened to keep the peace, their needs, postponed indefinitely. When they finally turn that gaze inward, toward themselves, it disrupts everything they believe about who they are and what love means. The empath begins to see that what they called love was often self-abandonment. That their constant giving, their unending patience, was not always an act of grace but sometimes a survival strategy. A way to be needed so they would not be left. The roles they played, caretaker, peacekeeper, emotional sponge, begin to feel foreign, even suffocating. Their capacity for empathy, once their superpower, now reveals its shadow side, the tendency to absorb pain that is not theirs, to carry burdens they were never meant to hold, to lose themselves in the labyrinth of others' wounds. When the empath chooses themselves, they are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth, that many of the masks they wore were not born of love, but of fear. This moment, though liberating, is not gentle. It is marked by grief. There is mourning for the time lost, the energy spent on people who never reciprocated, the years of translating unspoken needs while their own remained unmet. There is rage too at others, yes, but also at the self for allowing it to continue for so long. And yet, there is also awakening. Like a dreamer coming out of a fog, the empath begins to see that their worth was never tied to how much they could endure. That love, real love, does not demand that they disappear. As the empath peels away the old layers, the mask of the persona begins to crack. The persona is the social face they wore to navigate a world that often rewards compliance over authenticity. It is the part of them that smiled when they wanted to cry, that said, "It's okay," when it wasn't, that remained silent to keep harmony intact. But when they choose themselves, the persona loses its power. In its place arises the raw, unfiltered self, the self that is not always agreeable, not always available, not always pleasant. And for the first time, that feels like freedom. But this shedding does not go unnoticed. Those who benefited from the empath's self-denial may resist the change. They may accuse the empath of becoming cold, selfish, distant. Relationships built on imbalance begin to tremble, even collapse. The empath, once the emotional anchor, is now seen as a disruptor. This backlash, while painful, becomes the test of their commitment to themselves. Will they retreat to the safety of their old role? Or will they stay the course and allow the discomfort to burn away what is no longer true? In choosing themselves, the empath begins to understand that authenticity requires the courage to be misunderstood. In this initiation, they do not become less loving. They become more discerning. They no longer love at the cost of their own well-being. They no longer offer empathy without reciprocity. And in doing so, they begin to build a new relationship with themselves, not based on guilt or obligation, but on mutual respect. The world may not immediately understand this transformation, but the soul does, and in that knowing, a quiet power begins to rise, one that was always there, waiting beneath the surface. When the empath finally begins to choose themselves, a silent door opens deep within the psyche, leading them into the realm of the shadow. A place they have spent most of their lives unconsciously avoiding. This shadow is not evil, as often misunderstood, but rather a reservoir of everything they were taught to suppress: their anger, their unmet needs, their disappointments, their desire to be more than just useful to others. For the empath, who has long been the emotional caretaker, facing this inner terrain can feel like betrayal. After all, their sense of identity has been constructed around being good, being kind, being selfless. But in this confrontation with the shadow, they come to understand that what they have denied within themselves has not disappeared. It has only grown more potent in the dark. They begin to see how their suppressed emotions have been leaking out in subtle but powerful ways. Perhaps in quiet resentment that simmers beneath their gentle words, or in exhaustion that they mistook for compassion fatigue, or in the repeated patterns of being drawn to those who take more than they give. The empath is forced to acknowledge that the very behaviors they resent in others are often mirrors of what they themselves have allowed. It is a sobering realization, to see that they have not only been victims of emotional imbalance but also enablers of it. This is the beginning of integration. The point at which the empath begins to reclaim the parts of themselves they were once taught to exile. Anger becomes one of the first emotions to emerge, raw and unapologetic. It rises from the depths with a force that surprises them. They have spent years trying to avoid conflict, suppress irritation, and smile through discomfort, all in the name of peace. But now the anger speaks not to destroy but to protect. It says, I deserve better. I have needs too. I am not here to be consumed. And as the empath allows this voice to speak, they feel something shift, something ancient and buried that begins to stir. It is not violence, it is vitality. The return of the life force they had given away in small, unnoticed sacrifices. There is grief as well. Not only for the pain they have endured, but for the self they never got to be. The empath begins to mourn the versions of themselves that were always bending, always yielding, always anticipating the needs of others while ignoring the call of their own soul. They feel the weight of lost years and missed opportunities, of friendships where they were valued only for their emotional labor, of love that required their silence to survive. And yet this grief is not a pit, it is a passage. It opens the door to compassion, not just for others but for themselves. They begin to see that their coping mechanisms were not flaws, but strategies learned in environments where self-sacrifice was mistaken for love. The deeper they go into the shadow, the more clearly they see the complexity of their inner world. They begin to discern between intuition and anxiety, between genuine connection and energetic entanglement, between love and dependency. Their empathy becomes less reactive and more rooted. They no longer rush in to fix or to soothe as a way of maintaining their place in someone else's life. Instead they begin to witness without absorbing, to feel without disappearing, to hold space without losing their center. They start to embody a quieter kind of strength, one that does not need to be validated by being needed. This transformation is not loud. It does not announce itself with declarations or dramatic severances. It unfolds slowly like a soft revolution within. The empath who once felt everything begins to feel themselves, perhaps for the first time. And in doing so, they begin to remember who they were before the world taught them that being lovable meant being less. When the empath chooses themselves, a quiet and radical unraveling begins in the places where codependency once masqueraded as love. What once felt like connection now feels like captivity. And what once passed as devotion is revealed as a pattern, unconscious, inherited, and often reinforced by subtle emotional contracts that were never spoken aloud but deeply understood. The empath begins to see how often they gave more than they had. Not from abundance, but from a desperate hope that the giving would secure a place in someone's heart. They realize that much of their presence in other lives was transactional at its core. Not in a material sense, but in the unspoken belief that their worth was dependent on how much they could endure. How little they could ask for. How invisible they could become in order to be accepted. This moment of realization does not come gently. It arrives through the quiet fatigue in their bones after years of emotional labor. Through the echo of their own voice not being heard, through the heavy silence left behind after one-sided conversations. They begin to understand that codependency is not love, it is the fear of being alone dressed in the language of sacrifice. It is the deep entanglement of identities, where the lines between self and other blur so thoroughly that the empath no longer knows where they end and the other begins. They remember the times they absorbed another's sadness like it was their own. The way they bent and contorted themselves to avoid rejection. The way they tolerated mistreatment with the hope that patience would eventually be rewarded. When the empath sees this pattern clearly for the first time, something within them rebels. A quiet voice long ignored begins to speak. It says, I cannot keep doing this. I cannot keep breaking myself to keep others whole. I cannot keep giving from a place that has never been filled. This rebellion is not loud or external. It happens in subtle refusals. In the decision not to reach out first. In the choice to let the phone ring unanswered. In the courage it takes to speak a need out loud and not apologize for it. These are the quiet severings that begin to dismantle codependency and make space for something more real, but this untangling is not without grief. As the empath begins to pull back from unhealthy attachments, they are met with confusion and even hostility from those who benefited from their self-abandonment. People may say they've changed, become cold or withdrawn. The empath who was once the emotional scaffolding for others, is now seen as unreliable or distant. Yet, they begin to understand that it was never their responsibility to carry another's emotional weight. That love should never demand the loss of one's selfhood. And that any connection requiring them to betray their own boundaries is not love, but dependency in disguise. This stage is marked by a growing clarity. The empath begins to observe the relationships that only functioned as long as they remained small, agreeable, and endlessly giving. These connections start to feel heavy, unsustainable, and sometimes even toxic, and in this clarity the empath starts to choose differently. They begin to seek out reciprocity instead of rescue, honesty instead of enmeshment, presence instead of performance. They begin to recognize that they are allowed to take up space, not just in relationships, but in life itself. As they do this, something begins to shift deep within them. Where once they would have felt guilt, they now feel relief. Where once they would have rushed to fix, they now allow silence. Where once they feared being alone, they begin to savor their solitude. This is not a hardening of the heart but a softening toward the self. The empath no longer sees love as an endurance test, but as something sacred, mutual, and free. They begin to trust that they are worthy, not because of what they give, but simply because of who they are underneath all the roles they once believed they had to play. When the empath finally begins to choose themselves, something fundamental shifts in how they understand boundaries, not as barriers to love, but as the very structure that allows love to be healthy, clear, and free from distortion. For most of their life may have associated boundaries with rejection or abandonment, believing that to set limits was to push others away, to risk disconnection, to become someone cold or unkind. They may have feared that saying no would mean losing love, that prioritizing their needs would make them unworthy of being chosen. And so they adapted. They said yes when they meant no, they stayed when they wanted to leave. They listened for hours while silencing their own voice. They held space for others even when they had none left for themselves. But as they begin to return to themselves, something within them no longer permits this quiet betrayal. A new understanding emerges, one rooted in truth rather than fear. They begin to feel that every time they said yes out of guilt, they were abandoning themselves, that every time they remained silent to avoid conflict, they were deepening the conflict within. The empath begins to realize that boundaries are not the end of connection, but the beginning of authentic relationship. That without clear lines there is only fusion, not intimacy. That love without boundaries quickly becomes obligation. And that compassion without self-respect becomes self-destruction in slow motion. This realization is not always met with ease. The first boundaries they attempt to set may come out clumsily or with too much force, like a child learning to walk after years of crawling. They may say no with shaking hands or draw lines that others resist or ignore. They may experience backlash from people who were used to their availability, their compliance, their quiet willingness to bend. And in those moments the empath is tested, not just by the reactions of others, but by the guilt that arises inside them. The old conditioning that whispers they are doing something wrong simply by choosing their own well-being. Yet with each act of boundary setting, they begin to reclaim pieces of themselves they hadn't realized were lost. They start to trust the signals of their own body, the quiet no that rises in the chest, the discomfort that flares when something is misaligned, the exhaustion that follows every overextension. They begin to pause before saying yes, to assess whether they have the emotional bandwidth, whether the request feels reciprocal, whether their agreement would come from love or from fear. And slowly, they begin to feel the difference between connection that expands and connection that depletes them. They start to create space in their lives. Not just physical space, but emotional and energetic space, space to rest without apology, space to be alone without feeling abandoned, space to feel their own feelings without absorbing the emotions of others. This space becomes sacred, and within it, the empath starts to grow a deeper relationship with their own voice, their own desires, their own rhythm. They begin to feel the strength in restraint, the dignity in silence, the power in selective presence. Their empathy becomes sharper, more discerning. No longer something that leaks uncontrollably, but something they offer with intention and clarity. They begin to understand that not everyone is entitled to their energy. That love given freely does not mean love given endlessly, and that their role is not to rescue, repair, or redeem those who refuse to meet them in mutual respect. They start to see that their own needs are not inconveniences but compass points guiding them back to integrity. And in this newfound clarity, the empath begins to feel something they may not have felt in years. Sense of safety within themselves. A groundedness that comes from knowing they can protect their peace, honor their truth, and still remain open-hearted with being wide open to harm. When the empath finally chooses themselves, something extraordinary begins to unfold, a return, not to the world as it was, but to the self as it was meant to be. After the shedding, the grieving, the setting of boundaries, and the breaking of old patterns, The empath does not disappear into solitude forever. Instead they begin a slow and intentional re-entry, but they return changed. Where once they were driven by the compulsion to heal, to help, to be all things for all people, they now carry discernment like a lantern in the dark. They no longer step into every story they're invited into. No longer tether themselves to the emotional weather of everyone they meet. No longer believe that their presence must be constant in order to be meaningful. There is a calmness in their presence now, a quiet that does not come from silence but from self-possession. They can still feel deeply, still sense the unsaid, still recognize the undercurrents in a room, but they are no longer pulled by them. They begin to witness rather than absorb, to hold space without abandoning their own. They have learned that their sensitivity is not a weakness to be hidden, or a skill to be exploited, but a form of wisdom to be protected and directed with intention. Their empathy becomes less about merging with others and more about standing beside them without losing themselves. This is the return with wisdom. Not the naive giving that once left them hollow, but a grounded offering that is sustainable, honest and clear. They no longer equate love with overextension. No longer believe that their value lies in their capacity to endure pain in silence. They offer their presence now not as a currency for belonging, but as a gift given freely and consciously. They understand that showing up for others must never come at the cost of not showing up for themselves. They have become fluent in the language of reciprocity, no longer enchanted by one-sided dynamics, no longer mistaking intensity for intimacy or chaos for connection. They begin to choose relationships that honor their growth, that do not shrink in the face of their boundaries, that do not punish them for being whole. The people they now allow into their inner world are those who see them, not just need them, those who value their clarity as much as their kindness. These new connections are slower, steadier, rooted in respect rather than reliance. And in these spaces, the empath learns something profound. That they can be loved without being depleted, that they can be seen without performing, that they can exist without constantly proving their worth through emotional labor. They also find that solitude, once feared, has become sacred. They are no longer running from their own company, no longer filling every quiet moment with someone else's noise. They begin to listen to their own rhythms, to honor their energy, to engage with the world from a place of fullness rather than lack. Their intuition becomes louder now that it no longer has to compete with the noise of unmet expectation, unreciprocated giving. Their creativity begins to flow again. Their joy returns not in grand gestures but in subtle moments of peace, presence, and alignment. There is a softness to them still, but it is no longer the softness of collapse, it is the softness of strength. Of someone who has walked through the fire of transformation and come back carrying only what was essential. They do not need to prove their depth, because it is felt in their grounded presence. They do not need to explain their boundaries, because they are lived and embodied. They no longer rescue others to avoid their own healing, no longer betray themselves to maintain peace that is not real, no longer shrink to fit into spaces that were never built to hold their fullness. And so what happens when the empath finally chooses themselves? They become whole. They become sovereign. They become what they were always meant to be. Not a vessel for other people's healing, but a force for truth born from their own. To choose oneself is not to abandon others. It is to finally arrive home. Thank you.